All right. Okay, I think we're good to get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming on your Saturday afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world, to join us today for this engaging and hopefully timely discussion with Michael Krepon. I'm sure we're all used to Zoom and webinar formats like this by now, but just as a small reminder, just so you know, this session is being recorded. So anything you say during the Q&A portion will be on record. Chats will not, and Student Pugwash USA intends to use the recording on its website and for future event promotion. When we get to the Q&A part of the talk, feel free to either raise your hand and request to unmute and ask a question, or ask using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd rather stay anonymous, you can select that option there. Please feel free and encouraged to drop your questions in the Q&A box during the opening remarks from Michael, and we'll get to them during the Q&A section. We want this discussion to be as audience-driven as possible, and Michael is keen to answer all of your questions. And lastly, closed captioning is enabled, and you can enable and disable that at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I think we'll dive right into it. And it's important, I think, at the beginning to say that today's talk has been organized by Student Pugwash USA with the generous support of several co-sponsors, not least Arizona State University, who have supplied the tech behind the webinar, and the Stimson Center, who have supplied us their co-founder and acclaimed author, Michael Krepon. Thanks must also go to International Student Young Pugwash, the Scoville Peace Fellowship, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and the Trebuchet for their support. For the uninitiated, Student Pugwash USA is the student and young professional branch of the Nobel Peace Prize winning Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs for the United States. It falls under International Student Young Pugwash and also supports the Rotblat Society for non-students. SPUSA aims to empower and equip students and young professionals to identify, critically analyze, and shape the ethical policy and societal dimensions of science and technology, with a focus in particular on nuclear weapons. For those in the US interested in SPUSA, or those internationally based who fall under ISYP or another young national group, we encourage you to stay on the webinar after the discussion with Michael to hear from SPUSA Chairman Jeff Porton and ask any questions. I'm also happy to field any questions on either SPUSA or ISYP as a board member of both. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the reason we're all here today. We're very grateful today to be joined by Michael Krepon. Michael co-founded the Stimson Center in 1989 and served as Stimson's president and CEO until 2000. He is the author and editor of some 22 books, including his most recent title, Winning and Losing the Nuclear Peace, The Rise, Demise, and Revival of Arms Control. He worked previously in the executive branch on Capitol Hill and received the Carnegie Endowment's Award for Lifetime Achievement in Non-Governmental Work to Reduce Nuclear Dangers in 2015. Michael is joining us today to discuss the war we're all familiar with in Ukraine and the future of arms control with it in mind. And with that, I'll hand over to Michael for his opening remarks.
I'll be happy to speak, but you need to identify yourself.
That's a good point. So I'll be the moderator for today. My name is Shane Ward. I'm a board member of both Student Pugwash USA and International Student Young Pugwash. And yeah, your grateful host and moderator.
Thank you, Shane. So we live in dark times, and this isn't the first time. And it's easy to lose hope. But I'm living proof that persistence matters and that we can make progress in this field. In 1969, when I was Shane's age, and when the year Jeff Porton was born, there were 38,000 nuclear weapons in the world. That was a very big number. And the number got bigger. When I was 30 years old, there were 49,000 nuclear weapons in this world. When I was 40 years old, there were 64,500 nuclear weapons in this world. We were traveling in the wrong direction. When I was 50 years old, the dividends of hard labor, hard diplomatic labor, hard labor by non-governmental organizations, by government officials began to kick in. When I was 50 years old, there were 28,000 nuclear weapons in this world. Today, I'm 75 years old, and there are 13,000 nuclear weapons among us. Now, 13,000 is way too many. It's deeply troublesome, but it is a small number due to the persistence and the commitment of people to progressively reduce nuclear dangers and nuclear weapons. We've made a ton of progress despite severe setbacks. When I was in government, I worked for President Jimmy Carter. Our efforts to make the world a lot safer and to reduce nuclear dangers suffered a grave setback when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. But that setback was temporary. There was a change in government in the Soviet Union, a change in leadership, and doors opened. The history of this work is to expect unexpected events, not the worst cases, thank God, but it's always darkest before the dawn in this field. You think you're down and out, and you get up the next morning and you keep trying, and there are shifts that enable progress, surprising progress. After decades of hard labor, people organizing others, marching in the street, carrying out teach-ins, working in negotiations, working in all kinds of ways. We created conditions for lasting nuclear peace as the Cold War ended. This is a remarkable achievement that hasn't gotten its due. But think about this. When the Cold War ended, there were no nuclear detonations in warfare. Amazing feat. Nuclear testing had stopped by all of the major regional powers and the two nuclear superpowers. No nuclear testing. That didn't come easy. That took a tremendous amount of work. Respect for the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of other states. These achievements couldn't happen, could not have happened without that fundamental norm. Dangerous military practices, which were very prevalent during the Cold War, had pretty much stopped when the Cold War ended. Threats to use nuclear weapons by the two superpowers and by major regional powers had been greatly reduced, not eliminated. Channels of trusted communication were open, and they were essential, and they were open because of arms control negotiations. That's how they opened. I could go on. There were other key elements of nuclear peace, but they were in place when the Cold War ended. Now, many of these key elements are not in place. We've been backsliding. And this is an unfortunate characteristic of our field. We've got to rebuild. We've got to persevere. We've got to be creative. We also have to be insistent. But we can do this. I'm living proof that we've done it before, and we can do it again.
Thank you, Michael. So we would love to turn this into a great discussion and draw on some of Michael's many years of wisdom in the field, particularly as it pertains to Ukraine, but also generally. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box down below or request to unmute, and we'll get as many of them to him as we can. So we have one question already in from Andy Kadak. He says, Putin is using the nuclear deterrent as a shield for his land war in Ukraine. What is being deterred is our ability to help Ukraine. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't see it that way. Let me start with deterrence. And then we can talk about the means by which countries are coming to Ukraine's aid. And this is totally essential if we're going to rebuild this edifice of arms control, which I believe we can do. But first, we have to demonstrate that you don't win by waging an aggressive war. You don't win by disregarding a fundamental tenet of nuclear peace, which is respect for the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of other states. Now, one of the things I've learned is that deterrence doesn't prevent war. Deterrence is dangerous. And under the umbrella of nuclear weapons, countries are free to engage in very dangerous, harmful practices using conventional forces. So there's already been 2 limited wars between states that possess nuclear weapons. So there was one in 1969, the year Jeff Porton was born, between the Soviet Union and China. There was one in 1999, a limited war, between India and Pakistan. And there are still border incursions and skirmishing between India and Pakistan, between India and China. So let's be clear about what deterrence cannot do. It can't prevent bad decisions. So far, offsetting nuclear deterrence has prevented mushroom clouds in nuclear warfare and has prevented mushroom clouds between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear armed states. And there have been a clutch of examples already where the nuclear armed state has lost in warfare against a non-nuclear armed state. So we could talk about Afghanistan more than once. We can talk about Iraq the second time around in the George W. Bush administration. And I think Vladimir Putin is going to lose this war too. So remember, when a major power wages war against a weaker state and the result is stalemate, that's a loss. That's a loss for the major power. It's a loss for the nuclear armed state. Now we got to be ever vigilant, and we have a role to play in making sure that there are no mushroom clouds in this war, and that we extend the 3/4 of a century long norm of no use in warfare, no mushroom clouds in warfare. That's fundamental for us. We can build on that. We would suffer a grievous blow if Putin used a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon. And so we have to continually remind him that if he does this, he will place Russia's national security at risk, even graver risk than is now the case. That he will become the 21st century equivalent of Adolf Hitler. That's how bad it would be if he used a nuclear weapon or chemical weapons against the Ukrainian people. Now, I think we need to hold steady, support Ukraine, and do it in ways that don't lead to World War III and mushroom clouds. I think that's possible. That's our job.
Thank you, Michael. Let's turn to an in-person question. Dan Caldwell, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Michael.
Michael, thank you very much for these comments. And I have a question, and that is, when you write the second edition of Winning and Losing Nuclear Peace, what revisions, if any, would you make in your magnificent book based upon what's happened in Ukraine thus far?
Well, first of all, a disclaimer. Dan Caldwell is a dear friend of mine and a great booster as well, and an amazing teacher. So having said that, if we get through this crisis, as I think we can, without nuclear weapons use, where the aggressor loses, I think we can rebuild. We have the basis to rebuild. And as for how we rebuild, I still am committed to the ideas I presented in the book. And maybe I ought to talk about them a little bit, because they're somewhat unusual. I mean, I was born and raised on treaties. I bled for treaties. Our questioner, Dan Caldwell, wrote the book on the SALT II ratification debate. So he knows whereof I speak. But treaties, new treaties, are really hard right now for lots of reasons. Starting with domestic politics in the United States, which are so fractured and that need to be healed. But until the healing comes, which might come actually with a Republican president, hard to see it coming with a Democratic president. anytime soon. Until that healing occurs, you can't get 67 votes in the Senate. So I feel a strong obligation to support the existing treaties that have remained despite the teardown. They're really important multilateral treaties. And we have one remaining strategic arms reduction treaty, still on the books, very important. But how do we make headway in the future? Some of us are inclined to think that we make headway through major accomplishments, big treaties. And any treaty that tries to capture US, Russian, and Chinese nuclear forces is going to be a very hard slog. I've come around to a different approach while still respecting how much other people believe in treaties. In my view, we can make progress every single day, by strengthening the norms of no use of nuclear weapons in warfare, no testing of nuclear weapons, full stop. No use, no testing. Every day that passes without no use and no testing is a good day for us. It's a successful day for us. And now I want you to use your imaginations. And I want you to fast forward to the year 2045. The 100th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I want you to think about the world that some of you will live in 2045, in which nuclear weapons have not been used in battle for a century. I want you to think about a world in which nuclear weapons haven't been tested, at least by major powers and regional powers. I can't speak for North Korea, but for everybody else, nuclear weapons haven't been tested for almost half a century. Now, how many nuclear weapons do you think states would feel they absolutely had to have in the year 2045 if these weapons hadn't been used for a century in warfare and hadn't been tested for decades and decades and decades? I suspect that the number will be less than 13,000, the number we currently live with, and considerably less. So my exhortation to you is to use your imagination and your energies to create the conditions by succeeding every single day. And you can, by succeeding every single day, you can create the conditions for extraordinary accomplishment. So that's my game plan. And there's more to it, but I think that's the essence of it.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to say as well, while the questions are rolling in, and thank you so much for so many wonderful questions. Feel free to respond to other people's questions as well. Just elaborating a little bit maybe on some of the points you made there, Michael. Thomas Countryman asks one question that's on the minds of most people. What are the chances of the Putin regime using a nuclear weapon in the current conflict, in your opinion?
Thank you, Tom. I think they're low, but they're not zero. And when the stakes are this high, even a low probability, demands our attention. And I think it demands our activities to stigmatize the potential use of a nuclear weapon in this war. I mean, Putin would be the only person in human history to have waged an aggressive war and to have used a nuclear weapon against a country that repatriated its weapons back to Russia in return for security assurances from Moscow. Is this what Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership and the Russian people want? I don't think so. But we just got to keep hammering away at this. We need to get through this crisis just the way people before us got through other hair-raising crises without nuclear weapons use.
So a couple of people are asking kind of what the steps that the West and NATO and the United States should take. Paul Amoroso specifically mentions the Russian doctrine of escalate to de-escalate when it comes to nuclear use, and asks, how do we accommodate such an approach without emboldening Russia and at the same time not forcing them into a corner? I think one concern many people have is this is a war that Putin can't afford to lose. So how do we make sure that this war can be de-escalated without fatally humiliating Putin and Russia? How do we walk this tightrope?
This is really hard. These are great questions. And while Putin can't afford to lose according to our conventional wisdom, he's not going to win. He's not going to win this war. He's losing his army. And the longer he tries to hold ground, let alone seize it in Ukraine, the more tanks, armored personnel carriers, helicopters, trucks, and everything else he's going to lose. So, but we do need a negotiating end game. I get that. It's important, if Putin stays in power, to offer him an exit strategy. But it's not one that gets him a whole lot, certainly not a whole lot more than he had going into this war. So this is so hard. And some of us who have read books about the Cuban Missile Crisis keep mentally going back there. And there are some great books about the Cuban Missile Crisis that I highly recommend. And they're fairly recent. There's one by Michael Dobbs, and there's one by Sergei Plokhy that you can check out. And the way President Kennedy gave Nikita Khrushchev an exit was to do some things that Khrushchev wanted, but not to do them in public. So there are variations on that theme for Ukraine and ending this war. I think the Ukrainian president has begun to hint at some of the possible ways out for Putin. He's no longer talking about joining NATO. In effect, he's retrieving what President George W. Bush unwisely advanced. And there are other possibilities as well. Ukraine certainly can't agree to disarmament arrangements, not after it's been invaded. And it's not going to turn its back on the West. It's heading westward because of this invasion, and it's never going to bow eastward. Ain't going to happen. So within those outlines, I think diplomats can find some creative pathways. But if we want to rebuild arms control, if we want to reduce nuclear danger, and I think everybody on this Zoom feels that way, then I think we have to be honest with ourselves that Putin has to lose this war, and he's in the process of losing it. And typically after massive screw-ups by Moscow, there is leadership change. Now, it's pretty hard to predict this time around, but it happened after Khrushchev sent those missiles to Cuba. It happened after Brezhnev and a rump group in the Politburo decided that keeping Afghanistan in the red column was a really good idea. And I wonder if it's going to happen again. And when it does, I think it's really important for us to be ready. Okay, how do we take charge and move out to reduce nuclear danger?
Thank you, Michael. There's some great points there I'd like to pick up on in a minute with a few other questions in the Q&A. But I'm going to unmute Lake Dodson, who's had their hand up for a little while to ask a question to you directly.
There we go. I think I'm on here. All right. Well, firstly, thank you so much for this. And I had two questions that kind of worked in tandem with each other. Firstly, while it may not directly relate to nuclear weapons, I wanted to ask you about if you had any thoughts on thorium or thorium power as it relates to, an alternative source of energy. And then the second question relating to that was, I heard this on a statement from a similar panel. Would you agree that furthering nuclear power research could decrease the violent use of nuclear power with nuclear weapons?
I try not to answer questions that I know very little about. This is a practice of mine. And I can't answer your question about thorium. It seems to me on the second broader question, I have something I can say. And that is that nuclear power brings with it associated dangers. And everybody knows how to build power plants nowadays. And they're safer than they used to be. And we do have an international organization that's pretty darn effective in monitoring these power plants so that civilian use doesn't become military use. But there are parts of this equation that we just haven't made progress on after so many decades. We haven't made progress as far as I can tell, or we cannot implement politically solutions to the nuclear waste production problem after all these decades. You know, maybe the Finns can show us the way. But it's so hard. And what we're seeing now, and I'm afraid this is going to accelerate after Ukraine, is hedging strategies amongst states that haven't decided to get the bomb, but they don't want to be flat-footed if they need one down the road. And there are various ways to hedge. And one way to hedge, and we're seeing it amongst states in the Middle East that are awash in oil. We're seeing this
Looks like we might have lost Michael, possibly to some technical difficulties. We'll give him a moment to try and reconnect. Thank you again for all of your questions filtering in. I'm going to do the best we can. Hopefully we get Michael back very quickly to get through as many of those as possible. Jeff, I don't know if you'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about student Pugwash while we're without our arms control expert.
Well, I can do that now, or if we want to hold a discussion among the participants, that's fine too. Does anyone want to raise a question that they brought up in the Q&A? Oh wait, Michael is just coming back.
I'm sorry about that. Someone badly interrupted me. But hedging strategies are going to increase. And so I think nuclear power will become more prevalent in some respects and also more worrisome in others.
Thank you for tackling that very difficult question. A couple of questions in the chat, bringing the topic back a little bit to the conflict itself, about who or what entity, you know, is potentially has enough clout to insist on what you described earlier as, you know, no mushroom clouds. Several people mentioning the United Nations in their questions. What role, if any, can the United Nations play in this conflict and in arms control agreements between the West and Russia?
You know, we still don't have a champion for norms that we live by. Norms that we need to reduce nuclear danger and nuclear weapons. We don't have a champion. We certainly don't have a champion in terms of no nuclear threats, which is a very important norm that accompanies the non-proliferation norm, the no-use norm, and the no-testing norm. I mean, that leadership position is up for grabs, the way I look at it. And the UN is taking a leadership role with respect to codes of conduct for space, for cyber. I think, you know, these are hard problems and they're nowhere near close to getting where we need to be. But I think there's a role there for non-nuclear weapon states, for the UN, and we need champions among states that already possess nuclear weapons. And we need to bring China in. And I think a norm-based approach rather than a treaty and numbers-based approach is the way to bring China in.
Thank you. There is a question specifically about China. I don't know if you'd like to explore China's role in this conflict and in the future of arms control a little bit more. Bob Merching asks, what is China's thought process with regards to nuclear arms? How is it evolving, and how might their relationship with such weapons influence the posture of other nations, particularly other nuclear weapon states, regarding disarmament?
I think China's position is evolving. And I could offer some evidence in that regard. I'm not happy to see China's numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles and silos growing. But it reminds me of what the Soviet Union did during the end of the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration and early in the Nixon administration, which was they foresaw negotiations coming, and they didn't want to be in a position of weakness for those negotiations. Now, this sounds like a pretty strained positive for China's evolving role. But I think Beijing, these are very smart people. And they realize you just can't always say no. And you got to come up with some ideas that aren't obviously bogus to show your bona fides. Because people can see through ideas that are utterly self-serving and don't solve the problem, don't even begin to solve the problem, but they sound great. Well, I think China knows, Beijing knows that they're going to become players. So it's up to us to be smart enough to come up with a game plan that they can't reject very easily. I mean, they can reject treaties and numbers by demanding equality. But I don't think they can reject a norms-based approach, because in some respects, they actually lead the field in some elements of norm-based approaches. China's only tested 40-odd times nuclear weapons. Track record that is so much better than Washington and Moscow. China believes publicly, at least it states publicly, no first use. That's something that Washington and Moscow don't do. Let's get creative in a norms-based approach.
Thank you, Michael. There's a few points I'd like to come back on there, but you mentioned at the end some no first use, which is a policy which has kind of done the rounds in Washington for a little while. The Biden administration, there's also been a little bit of talk about pursuing a sole purpose declaration. Betty Sue asks, how can we start to rebuild ground for talks about arms control and arms reduction when the US is not willing to talk about things like sole purpose and no first use? And what effect is this crisis going to have on that?
It's really hard to make progress on arms control when two of the three most powerful countries are not satisfied with the status quo. So what we got here isn't just a US problem. It's a Russia problem. It's a China problem. And then we got a whole bunch of other problems too. Iran, North Korea, India, Pakistan. We have so many problems. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, what can make a problem more amenable to solution, or at least progress? And because we believe in treaties, we believe in the written word, we believe in the power of language, we tend to look at verbal solutions to really hard problems. If we just agreed to these words, if we adopted declaratory statements that a nuclear war must not be fought and cannot be won, for example, I believe in those words. Those words were crucial in getting us to a better place. But that's not what Vladimir Putin is saying now. It's something he said a couple months before he invaded Ukraine, but he didn't act that way. And he's still issuing nuclear threats. So I think it's important that people champion declaratory postures like sole authority or no first use. I think that's helpful. In my own mind, the formulation that I prefer is no use. No use. Nuclear weapons are of no use in warfare. Their use backfires on the user. And if we adopt that framework, I think we can capture the high ground in this argument. Because if we say instead, well, it has to be no first use, then we leave ourselves open to the rebuttal, well, tell that to Vladimir Putin. Tell it to him in this crisis, would you? So this is something we just have to sort out. We don't have to come to the same answer. Words matter. But I think messaging, I think we can get better at messaging.
Yeah, thank you. Just picking up on a point you made there about no use, and as it relates to arms control, there's one sort of group of weapons, of nuclear weapons, that have so far pretty much eluded the arms control regime. There are a category of weapons that Russia has the most of, and NATO has several, about 100 stationed in Europe, and they're tactical nuclear weapons. What is the risk? Corey Buot asks, with sanctions increasing and Russia potentially being backed into a corner, the risk of escalation into a conflict with NATO, what is the risk of a tactical nuclear strike being used by Russia, presumably? And if this did happen, what would be the de-escalation options available to the West?
Well, when we argue the case for no use, we don't care what the yield of the weapon is. We don't care what the range of the weapon is. We don't care what the means of employment are. We don't care about the target, although clearly some targets constitute absolute crimes against humanity. But what matters is use. And I think India and Pakistan have got this right, and we ought to borrow from them. Because in India and Pakistan, it's not about tactical versus strategic. It's not about short range versus intermediate range. Any use is a strategic consequence. Any use has massive strategic consequences. I think they've got that right. And I think we ought to borrow that lexicon. Now, it's true that Russia may have 2,000 of these weapons. Again, that number was way higher in my lifetime. What explains their non-use for 3/4 of a century? Oh, it's just a small yield. It's just going to be a small mushroom cloud. It's a signaling device. No. It's a world-altering event. The first nuclear detonation since Nagasaki is a world-altering event. It changes our world. It changes nuclear danger in significant ways. Let's not give deterrence strategists any leeway on this. We've got to hold the line. It's not just against intercontinental ballistic missiles dropping a nuclear weapon halfway around the world. It's everything. We hold the line. No use.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Robert Bell asks, so thinking ahead, and you know, it's difficult to assess when or how this war will come to an end. How, assuming that Putin is still in control, how do we negotiate with Putin specifically? Is it possible? Is it feasible for the US to negotiate new treaties on some of those categories of weapons with someone who many now consider to be a war criminal? How does the West approach that? Hopefully, in the event that the war, you know, comes to an end.
This treaty that's so important that we live by, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Bob Bell had something to do with both of them and deserves our plaudits for doing so. I think we can negotiate an outcome to this war with Vladimir Putin. I don't think we can negotiate with him on strategic arms control or intermediate range nuclear forces or tactical nuclear weapons or much of anything else after what he's done in this war. And it pains me to say that because I am not that patient a guy. I just don't see how we can do this. And I don't know how long we're going to have to wait, frankly, because this war is so disastrous to Russia. It's so disastrous to the Russian army that maybe he won't be around forever. But that's none of my business. That's a question for the Russian leadership and the Russian people.
Just conscious of, we have about 5 minutes left or so of the discussion. Thank you so much to everyone who's written a question. We're not going to get to all of those today. But before we get to one last question, Niall Mikkelsen, I'm sorry if I'm butchering anyone's names, asks, what do you say to people who say, you know, this conflict is in many ways proving the value of nuclear weapons, that it's that without nuclear weapons, this might have escalated into something more. Does the fact that it hasn't so far, touch wood, show the value of nuclear weapons? How do you respond to people who say something like that?
How valuable are nuclear weapons if you lose the coherence, the morale of your armed forces? I mean, how valuable are nuclear weapons if military adventurism results in a stunning defeat? So I don't see that many countries out there who are saying, okay, because I've got nuclear weapons, or because I'm close to getting nuclear weapons, or I want to get nuclear weapons, that will allow me to do something incredibly stupid. I mean, it's true there's no deterrent against bad judgment. I get that. But deterrence, it is clear from this war, is dangerous, and it can lead to bad judgment. It can reinforce bad judgment. So no, I don't see this war as being a resounding reaffirmation of the value of nuclear weapons, especially if they're not used in this war. Now, if they're used in this war, which would be such a terrible thing, I don't believe it'll change the outcome of the war. So there are ways for us to scramble and recover, but they're much, much harder if nuclear weapons are used in this war. And if they're not used in this war, if an aggressive war doesn't pay, well, as I've said, we've got something on which to rebuild.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to take a few more questions and maybe run to about 10:06, if that's okay. With everyone, would like to get as many questions in as possible. There's a hand up from Zoe, so I'm going to allow you to talk, Zoe, and feel free to ask a question directly to Michael.
Thank you, and thank you for talking to us today. In listening to this conversation, I think I agree that like nuclear weapons bad to use them. Just sort of, I understand the moral argument. I don't think Putin himself would jump for the moral argument, because just now you said, it would be terrible to use nuclear weapons. And I imagine myself saying that to Putin and getting laughed out of the building. It's a perfectly normal moral argument. I worry how it plays with people like Putin. So I think there's some things that Putin is paying attention to. I'm sure he is. And it's whether or not the world will intervene if he uses nuclear weapons, what it means to drop a quote unquote tactical nuclear weapon as opposed to a strategic one. And what exactly that would do for his leverage in the war with Ukraine. Because in my view, this war is about gaining leverage, because Putin wants leverage to get Ukraine to do what he wants, and Ukraine wants leverage because it doesn't want to do what Putin wants, which sounds like obvious, but it's sort of the A plus B plus C equals, number in like my equation for this war, which is, maybe not accurate because war and human conflict are not numbers, but so Putin sees his military suffering, he sees them stalling, isn't that more of a reason for him to use nuclear weapons because he wants that leverage? He hasn't seen the West intervene directly. The rest of the world may not intervene directly. The main issue would be then China and India, both of whom have been relatively kind with Russia for their aggressive war, potentially withdrawing, but then maybe he gets Ukraine to come to the table. And so based on that strategic calculus, I'm worried that the use of nuclear weapons is much more likely than you're portraying it. And so I'm kind of asking for you to disprove my logic here, because it's a terrible situation and the Ukrainians will continue to suffer. And, so please tell me why that's not true.
Zoe, I wouldn't use a moral argument with Vladimir Putin either. I would use security-based arguments with him. And I've tried to come up with about 5 of them. And if somebody has the courage around Putin to clarify this and use these arguments, then we might just be able to get through this war without nuclear weapons use. So I write a blog for arms control wonk, all one word, .com. And my latest blog post lays out reasoning that Putin might accept. And at the top of the list, it would be, if you do this, NATO's rules of engagement can change. And you may not like how they change. And the net effect will be worse for Russia if the rules of engagement change. There are other arguments. I think it's really important to try and we always argue why our own leaders should accept no first use. Now we got to figure out arguments why Putin shouldn't do no first use. And they're different arguments. If he uses nuclear weapons first, then the guy who wants to denazify Ukraine, and I use air quotes on denazify, will become the 21st century equivalent of Adolf Hitler. He likes to see himself as a heroic figure. Heroic figures don't use mushroom clouds. In a war that they started against the country that repatriated the nuclear weapons back to Russia and received security assurances for it. That's not a heroic act. Nuclear deterrence, after the beating that the Russian army has taken in this war and will continue to take as Western supplies reinforce the Ukrainian army. The beating that the Russian army has taken leaves nuclear deterrence as Putin's sole remaining high card. That's the last one he's got. But if you use a nuclear weapon, you shoot Russian nuclear deterrence in the foot. Think about this. Deterrence is strongest when the weapons aren't used. And after you use a weapon, deterrence takes a hit, a significant hit. There could be other uses. And deterrence is forever weakened. And other countries, after nuclear weapons use, are going to spend even more money on their nuclear deterrence. Other countries are going to increase their hedging. We talked about that. Please explain to me how Russian security is improved by this progression of events. There are other arguments, and I may be wrong. Maybe the possibility of use is greater than I am anticipating, and use would be disastrous. But I think we can get through this.
Thank you, Michael. There's one question on one sort of topic around this I'd really like to wrap up on, if that's okay. And I think it brings it full circle to where you started your talk about, the time that's passed and the reductions in nuclear warheads around the world that we've seen, and the differences between my generation and yours. And there's a question in the chat as well from Kathy about the role of young people in this conflict. One of the most promising things about this field, in my opinion, is the emergence of a strong vocal group of young professionals and students keen to shape the policy of tomorrow in the face of nuclear danger. You've committed much of your life to this field. And so for the arms control enthusiasts of tomorrow, or the young among us fearing for our future in light of a situation like Ukraine, what do you say? What do you say to young people facing this?
I say thank you. I am so grateful to see commitment and energy applied to this field. And Shane, you're starting out way before I started into it. That's amazing to me. And I see your grasp of these issues and people like you. They're all over Washington. And they're at the grassroots level in my country. I see this, and I see people who really have a head start compared to me. And I feel so thankful for this. This work is a baton pass. It really is. People who came into this field before me accomplished amazing things. So I stand on their shoulders. And I feel good about young energy, commitment, picking up the baton. I think you're going to have to be more creative than my generation was. I think you're going to have to find new models and build them into a structure that has some stuff that we've retained despite our losses. What the message I think that's truly important for me to give is that it's just essential to find mechanisms to refresh yourself in this work, because you're going to get knocked down. And that's part of the work. And you got to pick yourself up. You're facing tremendous resistance. Every good achievement, every great achievement has occurred against resistance. Domestic resistance, resistance from other governments, resistance from deterrence strategists who haven't figured out that arms control is an absolutely essential complement to deterrence, because deterrence by itself is way too dangerous. So how do you continue to get up out of bed in the morning despite all the resistance? And there, I think you probably already know intuitively what you need to revive your spirits. It varies from person to person. For me, I live in a beautiful place now. I no longer live, we raised our kids in the Washington, D.C. area. I no longer work there. I'm surrounded by woods and moss and ferns, and I get sustenance from nature. I look out at the woods around us and I see the effects of climate change. There are more dead trees in these woods than ever before. We've lived here for 20 years now. And yet I go out there today, which I will after this thing, and I'm going to see new shoots. I'm going to see life. I'm going to see nature telling me that despite the ways that we have been so unkind, it's going to try and do what it's supposed to do. How wonderful is that? And then there's family, which is crucial. But that's you're a little early in the game on that, Sheed. So find ways to refresh your spirit. It's crucial. And look for opportunities. You don't necessarily have to look for huge victories. You can achieve daily victories, and they will matter. They will matter big time as they accumulate. So please, come on in. The water's fine.
I think that's it's a very fitting way to end, Michael, and harks back to a quote of yours. I think you mentioned earlier. Daylight has a way of arriving at the right time, replacing darkness. Certainly a quote you used in a blog about the invasion shortly before it happened. So I think leaving us on a note of optimism is, in these worrying times, the best way to end this discussion. Although I think this discussion could probably go on for another couple of hours. I think we've had many excellent questions in the chat, and I'm very sorry we couldn't get through all of them today. But I know I'd like to say from us on the host side of things, thank you so much to Michael for his time and thoughts today. This has been a really fascinating discussion, one that I know I've really enjoyed. And I can tell from the engagement from the audience today that it's been enjoyed all around. So thank you for joining us, Michael. It's been lovely to hear from you. We did have a lot of questions we didn't get to. So Student Pugwash USA is looking to run a Slack channel to continue the discussion, and Jeff Porton will send some more information on that after the talk. And with that, I'm going to hand over now to Jeff at Student Pugwash USA. If you'd like to stick around, then I encourage you to do so, to hear a little bit more about SPUSA and ISYP for those of you not in the United States. We're going to do that now. So thank you again, Michael. Thank you to everyone for coming. Please stick around if you're interested, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, hi there. I didn't realize I was still on. Melissa, if you want to put Shane up as well, that'd be great. There we go. So I just want to say a little bit about Pugwash. The Pugwash movement was started in 1957 with the first Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs. That was a collection of scientists that responded to what was called the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, calling on the world to recognize the existential threats that are brought about by nuclear weapons. And the first Pugwash Conference was held to bring scientists together from both sides of the Cold War, from around the world, to have a discussion on scientific topics and engage with each other in a way that politicians weren't at the time. Student Pugwash started in 1979. That was when students came together to hold conferences that were along the same lines and to mimic what was happening at the what we call the senior Pugwash level. And Student Pugwash has since become an international movement. I'm the chair of Student Pugwash USA. Shane is on the board of International Student Young Pugwash, which is the umbrella organization for all Student Pugwash national groups around the world. The Russell Einstein Manifesto is on our website at studentpugwash.org. And the call to action is that here then is the problem which we present to you, stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Pardon me, my slides are not changing. There lies before us, if we choose continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. And then it was signed by Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, a number of other leading scientists of the day, and Joseph Rotblat, who went on to be one of the key leaders of Pugwash for the next 50 years. So Student Pugwash USA, every national group within the Student Pugwash movement chooses their own directives and interests for what they want to cover. Student Pugwash USA, we take an approach for a broad approach to ethics and STEM more generally. Like Shane said before, the first 4 words of our mission statement is to empower and equip students. We want to educate people. We want to bring people into the discussion who are not otherwise there. One of the key things we do as an extracurricular on college campuses is that we bring people to the table who are not necessarily studying this as their primary study interest. The other thing we do is that we bring people together interdisciplinarily across multiple fields. So there might be one event on nuclear weapons, and the next event on climate change, and a third event on cyber security and nanotechnology. And by exposing multiple topics to groups, experts, people become lay experts in fields that they're not necessarily studying, and getting a broad exposure to many different security issues and existential threats that may be coming in the next century. Our goal is to empower young people such that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when you're sitting in the, starting immediately when you immediately go into your careers, that you'll have considered ethical issues, have know multiple sides, multiple facets of every discussion, and feel that much more ready to take on whatever comes down the pike, because we want to prepare you for what we know will be the threats, but we also want to prepare you for what we don't see coming. So what's unique about Pugwash, in my opinion, the first thing is that we do not compete with other extracurriculars. We want to work in cooperation with other groups that are working in science, technology, society. So if you're a member of another science and technology group that is working on an issue that is similar to Student Pugwash, or is holding an event that's similar to Student Pugwash, let us know. We'll partner with you and we'll get that information out. We don't see this as a zero-sum game between organizations. We see this as a collaborative and partnership process. Like I said, we reach out to broad communities. We have one program, Student Pugwash, for students. We have another program called the Rotblat Society, which is for everybody who's no longer a student. And that's a combination of alumni network plus professional network plus donor network that helps us keep the lights on. Most of our revenue comes in from people who joined as Rotblat Society members and are donating in that way. And finally, we have the history of the Pugwash movement, which means we have excellent connections with many different organizations. I belatedly say a great thank you to Michael Krepon and the Stimson Center for a fantastic talk, and to Shane for excellent moderation. But the Stimson Center is one of many organizations that we stay in collaboration with and broadcast our events and keep people up to speed on areas that they might not otherwise be covering professionally in their email inboxes and mailing lists. So how to get involved with Pugwash more generally. The canonical Pugwash event is a discussion on a college campus or debate on an ethical issue in science technology. The more contentious the issue, the better. It's fine to have multiple points of view. The only rules for Pugwash debate is that they all have to be grounded in scientific fact. We don't take false facts here, and a respectful and respectful treatment of everybody concerned in the room. It's fine to say that somebody is wrong. It's not fine to say that somebody is incompetent or poorly trained. We also act as a kind of a Kickstarter for activist events, for activist activities. If you see the need for outreach, the need for some kind of change in your community that is not currently being hosted by some other organization, you can come to us and say, this is something that needs to happen. If we consider it to be Pugwash related, we'll absolutely support you in the work you're doing. If we know of other organizations that are doing similar work, we'll connect you to them, or we'll sponsor it as a new program for what we're doing. We definitely want this to be a combination of, say, 50% discussion and self-education and peer education, and 50% getting out there and actually doing things and getting involved and acting in your communities, or more generally acting across on a national and international scale. Again, the ways to get involved is to join as a member, or if you're not ready to do that, you can just sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter contains most of the information that comes out. Members will get advanced information, and we'll get invited to certain events and topics, and we'll get more extensive information on what we're up to. And again, that email, that web address is at studentpugwash.org. Our dues for students are suggested to be $12. Our dues for Rockwell Society members are higher because, again, that's our revenue stream. But no one is turned away for lack of ability. In fact, if you want to sign up and the dues are a hardship, then just sign up and let us know. We are, like I said, we were happy to host a Slack to continue this discussion today. For anybody who wasn't involved with it, we'll be posting the conference video, the seminar video shortly. We would like to host a vibrant online community of people working on multiple issues from multiple locations. And what's been causing that is we need the critical mass of people to start a discussion all at once. So if this group wants to do that, then we'd be thrilled to host that. We also would like to host an online database of other STS groups that are involved in this field, and we'll be doing that on our website shortly. And I'll say again that our programs are membership driven, meaning that if there's something we're not doing yet, we absolutely invite you to propose it. Maria, I see your hands up. I'll call on you in 1 second. I want to point people to our current program, the Pugwash Pledge, which is a self-study course in ethics. If you complete the course working with other peers in your group who are also taking the course, and that's finalized with a certificate and verification of verification of completion of the course, at which point you conclude on your CV, receive the certificate in the mail, and it's part of our training process to help people work with ethical issues that are coming down the pipe. We also have upcoming events that we're not quite ready to announce, but we're going to be doing probably going to be doing a summer conference on nuclear climate issues, the overlap of existential threats that are coming from those. And we'll have some major programs starting in the fall semester working on the same topics on nuclear and climate issues, which we'll be announcing to our members first and then on our newsletter list. My email address is jeff@studentpugwash.org, and anybody can contact me at any time if they want more information. Melissa, if you can call on Maria so we can see what her question is, that would be great. Maria, you're there? I see your microphone still turned off. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, I see Marie still has your hand up. That was the that was the end of my remarks. I'd like to thank everybody for turning out. I want to thank Michael and Shane again for an excellent conversation. I would not have told Michael that I was born in 1969 if I known he was going to mention it twice. I want to thank Shane especially for being the exemplar of the kind of people we try to bring into the network and try to serve, and for doing an excellent job of moderation. I agree with Michael that Shane, I don't mean to embarrass you, but having young people with the breadth of knowledge that you have and your ability to manage a discussion like this at your age is, I'd be impressed with somebody my age who is doing that. And I'm doubly impressed at the work you did. That was fantastic. So unless Maria wants to come in at the 11th hour, I think I will adjourn the meeting.